It wasn't just a slap. It was a thunderclap of tension that rippled through the dining room. Plates rattled, conversations halted mid-sentence, and the air thickened with disbelief. Claire, the daughter-in-law, sat frozen, her cheeks stinging red, not just from the physical blow, but from the humiliation that came with it. Across the table, Helen, the mother-in-law, stood trembling, her hand still suspended in the aftermath of her impulsive act. A pin could have dropped, and everyone would have heard it. The slap was loud, but what followed was louder in its silence. Claire didn't react, not immediately. Her gaze locked with Helen's, but her expression was unreadable. Everyone's eyes darted between the two women, searching for an anchor in this surreal moment. Mark, Claire's husband and Helen's son, was the first to break the stillness. "Mom, what the hell?" he barked, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Helen's lips quivered, but no words came out. Her face was a canvas of anger, regret, and something else no one could quite place. Claire, on the other hand, reached slowly for her glass of water. She took a deliberate sip, placed the glass back down, and then, with measured calm, said, "Why don't we all sit down? Dinner is getting cold." It was as though she had pressed a pause button on reality. No one knew what to do. The tension was palpable, but her composed demeanor forced everyone to comply, albeit hesitantly. As the family resumed their seats, the questions hung in the air like an unfinished symphony. Why had Helen slapped her? What had led to this moment? And most importantly, what was Claire's next move? Claire's journey into this family wasn't easy, nor was it typical. Born to a working-class family, she clawed her way up to become a respected lawyer, known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue. But beneath her professional armor lay a woman who deeply valued love and loyalty. When she met Mark, she thought she'd found both. Mark's family, however, was a different story. They were old money, the kind that came with a house too big for its occupants and expectations even larger. Helen had never hidden her skepticism of Claire. To her, Claire represented a threat to their traditions and a son she could no longer fully control. Over the years, Claire had tried, perhaps too hard, to bridge the gap. She attended family gatherings, tolerated Helen's backhanded compliments, and even brought gifts tailored to each member's interests. But no matter how much effort she poured into these gestures, Helen's icy demeanor remained. Claire often confided in Mark about her frustrations, but his response was always the same: "She'll come around. Just give it time." Time, it seemed, wasn't the cure Helen needed. Instead, it had turned their relationship into a powder keg, and tonight, it had finally exploded. Helen never thought of herself as cruel, but that slap, an uncharacteristic explosion of emotion, had torn through the veneer she worked so hard to maintain. The dinner table now seemed like a battlefield, but the war had started years ago, long before Claire entered their lives. Helen was a woman of tradition, raised to believe in a clear hierarchy within the family. She had dedicated her entire life to raising Mark, shaping him to be the man she believed he should be. When he brought Claire home, Helen's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Claire was everything Helen wasn't: confident, independent, and unapologetically modern. Worse, Mark seemed bewitched by her, taking her side in family disputes and leaning on her for decisions Helen used to make. It wasn't jealousy, at least that's what Helen told herself. It was concern. Claire's influence on Mark was undeniable, but Helen feared it would pull him away from the family's values. Over time, what started as subtle disapproval grew into resentment. She began to see every interaction with Claire as a power struggle, every family dinner as a test of dominance. Tonight, that tension had reached its peak. The day had started poorly. Helen had spent hours preparing dinner, determined to impress. But as soon as Claire walked in, she'd outshone Helen without even trying. Her compliments to the dishes felt insincere, her laughter too loud, her presence too commanding. Helen's frustration simmered, bubbling beneath her polite smile. When Claire corrected Mark on some trivial matter at the table, Helen's patience snapped. In her mind, it was yet another sign that Claire was erasing her influence over her son. The slap wasn't premeditated. It was pure reflex, a culmination of years of feeling invisible in her own family. Now, as she stood at the head of the table, her hand still tingling, Helen felt the weight of her actions. Regret clawed at her, but so did a stubborn refusal to back down. She'd spent years being sidelined. And for what? To be reduced to the villain in her own story? Helen glanced around the table. Mark's face was a mask of anger and disappointment. Claire's expression was calm, unnervingly so. The other family members, Helen's husband, their younger daughter, and a few distant relatives, sat in stunned silence. They were waiting for her to say something, to explain herself, but what could she say? How could she justify something so unjustifiable? Her mind raced back to her own mother, a woman as proud and uncompromising as Helen had become. She'd learned these behaviors, this rigidity, from her. Was she destined to repeat the cycle? Helen didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing. The damage had been done. As the silence stretched on, Helen's thoughts shifted to the past few months. There had been moments when she tried to connect with Claire, but each attempt felt forced. Perhaps it was her own insecurities that had sabotaged those efforts. Perhaps she'd been too focused on winning a battle Claire wasn't even fighting. She took a deep breath and finally spoke. The words caught in her throat. The room's oppressive silence made her stumble. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice trembling. Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she met Helen's gaze with an intensity that made Helen feel as though her entire soul was being laid bare. When Claire finally spoke, her tone was soft yet firm. This isn't about tonight, is it? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Helen's chest tightened. She wanted to lash out again, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew Claire was right. Tonight was the result of years of unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings, and unresolved tensions. As the rest of the family exchanged uneasy glances, Helen felt a pang of vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself in decades. Could she admit her mistakes? Could she let go of the control she clung to for so long? For the first time, she didn't have the answers, but she sensed that the choice she made now could define the rest of her relationships. Claire's steady gaze didn't waver. Helen could see that she wasn't waiting for an apology. She was waiting for something much harder, honesty. And Helen wasn't sure if she had it in her. As the room teetered on the edge of another confrontation, Helen's husband cleared his throat. Maybe we should all take a moment, he suggested, his voice gentle but firm. It was an out, a lifeline Helen could take or ignore. And for the first time in years, she hesitated, unsure whether to cling to her pride or reach for the possibility of redemption. The dinner table had always been a stage for subtle battles. Tonight, however, the tension was almost tangible, wrapping around every word and gesture like a tightening noose. Helen sat at the head of the table, her back rigid, her smile frozen. Across from her, Claire exuded a quiet confidence, her every movement measured yet effortless. The room's atmosphere vibrated with an undercurrent of unsaid words and unresolved grievances. It started innocuously enough. Helen complimented the roast she'd spent hours preparing, and Claire responded with a polite nod. "It's delicious," she said, her tone warm but her eyes distant. Helen's smile tightened. To her, it wasn't enough. Compliments from Claire always felt like currency, calculated and obligatory, never genuine. Mark tried to bridge the gap with light humor. Mom's been perfecting that recipe for years. I think she finally nailed it. His attempt at levity was met with a murmur of agreement, but it only served to highlight the gulf between his wife and his mother. Helen's husband gave her a small, encouraging nod, as if to say, "Let it go." But Helen couldn't let it go, not tonight. As the courses progressed, the conversation turned to family milestones. Helen brought up a recent charity event she'd attended, weaving in a subtle jab. It's always lovely to see how much effort people put into giving back, especially those who understand tradition. She glanced at Claire, whose face remained impassive. Claire's silence wasn't submissive. It was strategic. She knew better than to rise to the bait, and that only infuriated Helen more. The first real crack came when Mark mentioned their plans to renovate the guest house. "We're thinking of turning it into a home office for Claire," he said, his voice brimming with pride. "She's been so busy with her cases, it'll be a great space for her to focus." Helen's fork clattered against her plate. "A home office? In the guest house?" Her tone was sharp, her disbelief barely masked. "And what happens when we have visitors?" "We'll make it work, Mom," Mark said, his voice firm but patient. "It's not like we have guests every week." Claire finally spoke, her voice calm but laced with steel. "We've thought it through, Helen. It's the most practical use of the space." "Practical," Helen echoed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Practical for whom?" The table fell silent. Even the younger members of the family, who usually stayed out of the fray, looked uneasy. Claire met Helen's gaze steadily, refusing to back down. The moment stretched, the tension crackling like static electricity. Then came the final straw. Helen's younger daughter, trying to lighten the mood, brought up a childhood story about Mark. "Remember when you tried to build that tree house, Mark? You were so sure you didn't need any help, but Dad had to step in before you fell off the ladder." The table chuckled, but Helen saw her opening. "Mark's always been independent," she said, her tone pointed. "Too independent. Sometimes. But he's learned the value of family guidance." Her eyes flicked to Claire, the implication clear. Claire set her knife down carefully. Her expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Family guidance is important," she said, her voice steady. "But so is respecting each other's choices." Helen opened her mouth to respond, but Mark cut her off. "All right, that's enough," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Can we please just enjoy dinner?" The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. The tension was no longer subtle. It was a storm waiting to break. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. She took a sip, trying to steady herself, but the anger swirling inside her refused to be quelled. Claire, on the other hand, seemed unshaken. She resumed eating, her movements deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. Her composure was maddening to Helen, who felt as though she were being outmaneuvered in her own home. The room's atmosphere grew thicker with every passing second, until it felt like something had to give. And then it did. The sound of the slap echoed through the room, cutting through the murmured conversations and laughter like a thunderclap. For a moment, everyone froze. It was as if time itself had stopped to bear witness to this moment. Claire's cheek burned, the sting of Helen's palm more shocking than painful. But it wasn't just the physical blow that landed. It was the weight of years of unspoken resentment, the culmination of countless subtle slights and passive-aggressive comments. Helen's hand hovered in the air, as though even she couldn't believe what she'd just done. Her face was a mask of anger and regret, her chest heaving as if she'd run a marathon. Across the table, Mark's fork clattered onto his plate, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Mom, what the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Claire's initial reaction wasn't what anyone expected. She didn't cry, yell, or even flinch. Instead, she calmly set down her napkin, her movements slow and deliberate. Her gaze locked with Helen's, and for a moment, it felt as though they were the only two people in the room. Claire's eyes were steady, her expression unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity in her demeanor that made Helen shrink back slightly. "Is this how you solve problems, Helen?" Claire's voice was soft, almost conversational, but it carried an edge that sent shivers down everyone's spine. "By lashing out, by humiliating people." Helen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The enormity of what she'd done was sinking in, and for the first time in years, she found herself at a loss. Her husband, seated at the far end of the table, cleared his throat as though to speak, but one look from Claire silenced him. Mark stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. "I can't believe you," he said, glaring at his mother. "What gives you the right?" "Mark, please," Helen finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to what?" Claire interrupted, her tone sharper now. "You didn't mean to slap me in front of your entire family? Or you didn't mean to show everyone here exactly who you are?" The room was suffocatingly silent. Even the younger members of the family, who often found amusement in the adult squabbles, sat wide-eyed and motionless. No one dared to move or speak, afraid of fanning the flames. Helen's younger daughter, seated near the middle of the table, fidgeted nervously. She glanced at her father, who gave her a small shake of his head, silently urging her to stay out of it. But the tension was unbearable, and she finally blurted out, "Maybe we should just take a break? Clear our heads?" "No," Claire said firmly, her eyes still fixed on Helen. "We're not brushing this under the rug. Not this time." Her words hung in the air, daring anyone to challenge her. Helen's husband finally spoke, his voice calm but strained. "Let's all take a moment to breathe," he said. "This is getting out of hand." Claire turned to him, her gaze softening slightly. "Out of hand," she repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words." The family patriarch looked away, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Claire took a deep breath, as though steadying herself, and finally broke eye contact with Helen. She looked around the table, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. "I'm not going to let this ruin the evening for everyone," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "But I won't forget this, and neither should any of you." With that, she sat down, picked up her fork, and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. The audacity of her composure left everyone stunned. Helen sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. Mark, still standing, looked between his mother and his wife, his face a mixture of anger and helplessness. Finally, he shook his head and sat down, though he didn't touch his food. The rest of the family followed suit, their movements slow and uncertain, as though they were afraid of breaking the fragile truce that had settled over the table. But the air was still thick with unresolved tension, and everyone knew this was far from over. The slap was just the beginning. The weight of the evening bore down heavily on everyone at the table. Mark's chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as he stood, his hands pressed firmly against the table's edge. His knuckles whitened, and the tension in his posture mirrored the storm brewing within him. He looked at his mother, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "How could you?" he asked, his voice low but trembling with fury. Helen flinched. She had seen Mark upset before, but never like this. The bond they shared, once so strong and unwavering, now seemed frayed and fragile. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What could she say that wouldn't make things worse? Claire's calm demeanor only heightened the tension. She sat motionless, her hands neatly folded in her lap, her face a portrait of measured control. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet strength that was both unsettling and inspiring. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power in the room. Mark's voice broke the silence again. "You've crossed the line, Mom. This isn't just about Claire. This is about respect, and you've shown none." Helen's lips quivered. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that the slap wasn't premeditated, that it was a culmination of years of frustration and feeling sidelined. But deep down, she knew that no justification would suffice. The damage was done. "Mark, please," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen, but it did happen," Claire interjected, her tone soft but firm. "And now we have to deal with it." All eyes turned to Claire. Her calmness was almost unnerving, especially in contrast to the turmoil swirling around her. She looked at Helen, her gaze steady and unyielding. "This isn't just about tonight, Helen. This is about everything that's led up to this moment. The comments, the judgments, the constant undermining. It's all been building to this." Helen's husband, who had remained silent up to this point, finally spoke. "Claire's right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We've all seen it. This tension has been brewing for years. Maybe it's time we stopped pretending everything is fine and actually talked about it." Helen's eyes filled with tears. She felt as though the walls were closing in around her. The room she had always considered her domain now felt foreign and hostile. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said, her voice breaking. I've always tried to do what's best for this family." "But whose definition of best are we talking about?" Claire asked, her tone still calm, but cutting. "Yours? Because it certainly hasn't felt like it's been about what's best for Mark or me." The younger members of the family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Helen's younger daughter looked as though she wanted to speak, but hesitated. She glanced at her father, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Mom," the younger daughter said tentatively, "I think maybe you've been holding on to things that you need to let go of. Mark's not a kid anymore. He's got his own life now, and Claire's a part of that. A big part." Helen's tears spilled over. She looked around the table at the faces of her family and realized for the first time how isolated she had become. The slap wasn't just an act of frustration. It was a cry for help, a desperate attempt to regain control over something she had lost long ago. Claire stood up, breaking the silence. She walked over to Helen, her movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, it seemed as though she might extend an olive branch, offer some words of comfort. But instead, she placed her hands on the table and leaned in slightly. "This is your chance, Helen," she said quietly. "Your chance to make things right. Not just for tonight, but for all the nights to come. It's up to you." With that, Claire straightened up and returned to her seat. The room remained silent, everyone waiting to see what Helen would do next. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable, and it was clear that whatever came next would set the tone for the future of this family. Helen took a shaky breath, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of her family on her, each gaze filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The choice was hers, and for the first time in years, she felt the gravity of her position. The evening was far from over. Claire sat in her chair, the room's silence pressing against her like a physical force. All eyes were on her, waiting to see what she would do next, but Claire had no intention of giving anyone a predictable reaction. She wasn't going to cry, yell, or storm out. Those responses, she knew, would only give Helen the satisfaction of knowing she'd rattled her. Instead, Claire leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and measured, but it carried a weight that made everyone sit up straighter. "Helen," she began, locking eyes with her mother-in-law, "you've made your feelings about me very clear over the years. Tonight was just the loudest example." Helen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting to her husband and then back to Claire. But she didn't interrupt. Something in Claire's tone made it impossible to look away or speak out of turn. "I've spent years trying to earn your approval," Claire continued, her gaze unwavering. "I've tried to be respectful, accommodating, even apologetic for things I shouldn't have to apologize for. And for what? To be slapped in front of my husband, your family, and my dignity?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Claire raised a hand, stopping him. Let me finish, she said gently but firmly. He nodded, leaning back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and admiration. Claire turned her attention back to Helen. You've tried to make me feel small since the day we met. And for a long time, I told myself it was because you were protective of Mark, because you had a hard time letting go. But tonight, I see it for what it is. It's not about me. It's about you. The room was so quiet that the sound of the clock ticking in the corner was almost deafening. Helen's face flushed, her lips parting as if to respond, but Claire didn't give her the chance. This isn't about whether I'm good enough for Mark or whether I fit into your idea of what a wife should be, Claire said. This is about control. You've spent your whole life holding on to it, and you can't stand the thought of losing it. But here's the thing, Helen. It was never yours to begin with. Helen's husband shifted in his chair, clearing his throat as though to interject, but he quickly thought better of it. The younger members of the family exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure whether to admire Claire's bravery or cringe at the confrontation unfolding before them. Claire's tone softened slightly, though her words remained firm. I'm not going to pretend that what happened tonight didn't hurt me. It did. But what hurts more is knowing that this is how you see me, as an outsider, an intruder, someone who doesn't belong. And that's a shame, Helen, because I've always wanted to be a part of this family. I've always wanted to build bridges, not burn them. A single tear slipped down Helen's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, her expression a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. I'll say this one last time, Claire continued, her voice steady. I'm here because I love Mark. I'm not going anywhere. But if you can't find it in yourself to accept that, to accept me, then that's on you. I'm done bending over backward to make this work. The next move is yours. With that, Claire leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed but her eyes still locked on Helen's. The room remained silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. For the first time that evening, Helen looked truly unsure of herself. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her gaze dropped to the table. Mark reached for Claire's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I'm proud of you, he whispered, his voice so low that only she could hear it. Claire gave him a small, grateful smile, but didn't say anything. Helen's younger daughter finally broke the silence. She's right, Mom, she said quietly, her voice trembling. We all see it. This isn't just about tonight. It's been going on for years. Maybe it's time to let go. Helen's head snapped up, her eyes brimming with tears. She looked at her daughter, then at her husband, who nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. Finally, her gaze returned to Claire. Helen began, her voice shaky. I don't know how to fix this. Start by trying, Claire said simply. Her words weren't accusatory or harsh. They were a quiet invitation. A small olive branch extended across the chasm that had grown between them. The silence that followed was heavy but not hopeless. For the first time, there was a sense that something might change, that the cycle of tension and resentment could finally be broken. But the question lingered, would Helen take the first step, or would the opportunity slip away? As the family began to move on to dessert, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Conversations resumed, quieter and more subdued, but there was an unmistakable sense of something unspoken passing between Helen and Claire, a fragile truce, perhaps, or the faintest beginning of understanding. Whatever it was, it left the room holding its collective breath for what might come next. The dinner continued, but the mood had shifted. Conversations were subdued, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. As dessert was served, Claire glanced at Helen one last time, her expression a mix of hope and resolve. The night wasn't over, but a new chapter had begun. The dining room had finally quieted, the earlier eruption of emotions leaving a lingering tension in the air. Each family member seemed lost in their thoughts, their faces painted with varying degrees of discomfort, confusion, and unease. The meal sat unfinished, the clatter of silverware and muted murmurs now replaced by a heavy silence. Mark's younger sister, Emma, stared at her plate, her fork absent-mindedly tracing patterns in the sauce. For years, she had observed the subtle and not-so-subtle dynamics between her mother and Claire. Tonight, however, had laid it bare in a way that could not be ignored. She glanced up, her eyes flicking between her mother and Claire. She wanted to speak, but hesitated, unsure if her words would mend or further fracture the fragile balance. Helen's husband, Richard, shifted in his chair. The normally stoic patriarch of the family seemed unusually uneasy, his hands clasped tightly together. He had always been the mediator, the voice of reason, but tonight he had been silent, watching as decades of unspoken tensions came to a head. He cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention momentarily before shaking his head and sinking back into his thoughts. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who prided himself on maintaining the family's image. Across the table, Mark's cousin, David, adjusted his glasses nervously. He had always been the observer at these family gatherings, content to let others take center stage. Tonight, however, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Had they all been complicit in allowing the animosity between Helen and Claire to fester? Had their collective silence enabled the toxic dynamic that had culminated in such a public explosion? Emma finally broke the silence. Maybe we need to talk about this, she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. All of us, not just tonight, but everything, the way we've been, as a family. Helen's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing slightly. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her tone defensive but tinged with exhaustion. Emma hesitated, but Mark jumped in. It means we've all seen what's been happening, Mom. For years. And maybe it's time we stopped pretending everything is fine. His voice was steady but firm, a stark contrast to the earlier outburst. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped herself. Instead, she looked at Claire, who sat quietly, her composure unshaken. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting to see what Helen would do next. I never wanted this, Helen said finally, her voice breaking. I never wanted any of this. Claire tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening. What did you want, Helen? She asked gently. The question wasn't accusatory, it was an invitation. Helen's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at her hands, wringing them together as though searching for an answer. I wanted my family to stay close, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I wanted Mark to be happy. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what that meant. Richard reached over, placing a comforting hand on Helen's shoulder. We all make mistakes, he said quietly. But this doesn't have to define us. We can fix this, Helen. Together. Emma nodded, her earlier hesitation replaced with quiet determination. I think we all need to take a look at ourselves, she said, her voice gaining strength. This isn't just about Mom or Claire. It's about all of us and how we treat each other. David adjusted his glasses again, finally finding the courage to speak. She's right. We've all seen it, but we've been too afraid to say anything. Maybe because it didn't seem like our place. But staying silent hasn't helped anyone. Claire looked around the table, her eyes meeting each family member's in turn. This isn't about blame, she said. It's about moving forward. If we can do that, if we can be honest with each other, then maybe tonight can be the start of something better. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the oppressive quiet of earlier. It was a contemplative stillness, a collective pause, as everyone absorbed Claire's words. For the first time that evening, there was a sense of possibility, a faint glimmer of hope that the fractures in the family could be mended. Mark reached for Claire's hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you, he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. Claire gave him a small smile, her resolve unwavering. Helen wiped her eyes, her gaze settling on Claire. I don't know where to start, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I want to try. That's all I've ever wanted, Claire replied simply. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a resolution. Not yet, but it was a beginning. And as the family slowly began to talk, their voices low but earnest, the weight of the evening began to lift. For the first time in years, they were truly listening to one another. Outside, the night deepened. But within the dining room, a new chapter was unfolding, one filled with uncertainty, but also with the promise of healing. The dinner table became a theater for revelations, each new truth peeling back another layer of the family's long-buried history. Helen, who had always presented herself as the unwavering matriarch, now looked vulnerable, her composure cracking as the weight of the evening bore down on her. It was Emma who spoke first. "Mom, I think it's time we talked about Dad's illness, about what it did to all of us." Her voice trembled, but her resolve was firm. Helen's gaze shot to her younger daughter, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The room grew even quieter, the family collectively holding their breath. "I was just a kid," Emma continued, her words steadying as she pressed forward. "But I remember how much you carried, how much you sacrificed to take care of him. And I also remember how you pushed the rest of us away." She paused, her voice softer now. "We all felt it, Mom. We felt like we lost you, too." Helen's face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand as the tears came. For years, she had buried the pain of losing her husband to a slow, debilitating illness, and she had never allowed herself to acknowledge the collateral damage it had caused within the family. "I thought I was protecting you," Helen whispered. "I thought if I held it all together, I could shield you from the worst of it. But you didn't have to do it alone," Mark interjected, his voice tinged with both empathy and frustration. "You never let us help. You shut us out. And then, after Dad was gone, it was like you couldn't let anyone close again. Not even me." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Helen nodded slowly, her tears falling freely now. "You're right," she admitted. "I was so afraid of losing more that I ended up building walls around myself. And those walls, they didn't just keep the pain out. They kept all of you out, too." Claire, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. Her voice was calm, but her words were pointed. "And those walls didn't just keep us out, Helen. They turned into weapons. Every sharp comment, every cold glance. It was like you were daring us to break through, but you never gave us the tools to do it." Helen looked at Claire, her expression a mixture of shame and gratitude. I didn't know how much I was hurting you. All of you." Richard, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "We all carry blame in this," he said, his voice steady but heavy with regret. "I should have spoken up more, should have been the one to tell you when enough was enough. But I let you shoulder it all because I thought that was what you wanted." The confession hit Helen like a wave. She turned to her husband, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to feel alone," she said. "But I didn't know how to ask for help. And by the time I realized what I'd done, it felt like it was too late." Emma reached across the table, placing her hand over Helen's. "It's not too late, Mom. But we have to start being honest with each other. About everything." The family nodded in agreement, the air in the room shifting ever so slightly. The tension that had dominated the evening began to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of unity. But there was still one more truth to uncover. Claire straightened in her chair, her gaze steady. "Helen, there's something you need to know. Something I haven't told anyone before." The room stilled again, every pair of eyes now on Claire. "When Mark and I were first dating, I overheard you talking to one of your friends. You said I was too ambitious for him, that I'd never fit into this family." Helen's eyes widened in shock. Claire held up a hand to stop her. "Let me finish. At the time, it crushed me. I thought about walking away from Mark because I didn't want to come between him and his family. But then I realized something. I love him, and he loves me, and no matter what you thought of me, I wasn't going to let your opinion define me. Helen's mouth opened, but no words came. She looked down at her lap, her shoulders slumping. I was wrong about you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I see that now. You've shown more grace tonight than I ever have. Claire softened, her voice losing its edge. It's not about being right or wrong, Helen. It's about moving forward. But we can't do that unless we're honest about where we've been. The room fell silent once more, but this time it wasn't the suffocating silence of before. It was the silence of reflection, of understanding. And as the family began to speak again, their voices tentative but sincere, the beginnings of healing finally took root. Outside, the night stretched on, dark and quiet, but within the dining room, a fragile light had begun to emerge. The evening's events left an indelible mark on everyone present. As the dishes were cleared away, the family lingered around the table, their conversations subdued but meaningful. The air was heavy, not with tension this time, but with reflection. Helen, who had been the source of so much turmoil, sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of her family. For the first time in years, she didn't see adversaries or threats. She saw people she loved and people she had hurt. The realization was humbling. Richard, sensing Helen's internal struggle, reached for her hand. You've taken the first step tonight, he said softly. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Helen nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Across the table, Claire was speaking quietly to Emma and David. Despite the storm they had all weathered, her demeanor was calm, almost hopeful. She had always believed in the power of communication, and tonight had only reinforced that belief. But even she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Claire, Helen's voice broke through the murmurs. It was hesitant, almost fragile. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. I don't know how to fix everything I've done, but I want to try. Claire studied Helen for a moment before nodding. That's all anyone can ask for, she said. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that resonated deeply. Mark, who had been sitting quietly next to Claire, finally spoke. This isn't something we're going to solve overnight, he said, his voice steady. But if we're all willing to put in the effort, I think we can get to a better place. David chimed in, his usual nervousness replaced with a newfound confidence. It's going to take a lot of conversations like tonight, and probably a lot of uncomfortable moments. But I think we're all ready for that now. Emma nodded in agreement. We've been avoiding the hard stuff for too long. Maybe it's time we faced it head on. The family's collective resolve was palpable. For the first time, there was a shared understanding that healing wouldn't come from sweeping things under the rug. It would come from addressing the mess head on, together. As the evening wound down, the family began to disperse. Richard and Helen stayed behind, lingering at the table as the others moved to the living room. Helen watched as Mark wrapped an arm around Claire's shoulders, leading her to a quieter corner of the room. The sight filled her with a bittersweet mix of emotions, pride for the man Mark had become, and regret for the role she had played in creating distance between them. You'll get there, Richard said gently, following her gaze. One step at a time. Helen sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her thoughts. I just hope it's not too late, she murmured. In the living room, Emma and David had started a quiet conversation with Claire and Mark. Laughter punctuated their words every now and then, a small but significant sign that the night had taken a turn toward hope. Claire caught Helen's eye from across the room and offered a small, encouraging smile. Helen hesitated for a moment before returning it, her expression tentative but genuine. As the family began to settle into more comfortable interactions, the house seemed to exhale. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile but promising calm. There were no dramatic resolutions, no grand gestures of forgiveness, but there was something even more important, a willingness to move forward. Later that night, as the last of the guests left and the house fell quiet, Helen stood alone in the dining room. The table had been cleared, the chairs pushed back into place, but the echoes of the evening lingered. She placed a hand on the back of Claire's chair, her thoughts swirling. "Mom." Mark's voice brought her back to the present. She turned to see him, standing in the doorway, his expression soft but serious. "Are you okay?" Helen nodded slowly. "I will be," she said. "Thanks to all of you." Mark stepped forward, pulling her into a rare hug. Helen closed her eyes, letting herself lean into the comfort of her son's embrace. When they pulled apart, Mark smiled. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Mark," she replied, her voice steady. As she turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Helen allowed herself a small, tentative smile. The journey ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to take it. The light in the dining room flickered softly before dimming completely. It wasn't just an ending. It was a quiet beginning, a fragile promise of what could be. I would also like to apologize for any errors in the text for technical reasons. Some of the videos have been dubbed using artificial intelligence, and I would be grateful if you could point out any inaccuracies. This will give me the opportunity to improve the quality of the content in the future. See you in the next video.